In this episode, I want to present a sketch of the 1100s as a time when long gestating trends in European culture crystallized into an efflorescence of creative energies, which gave new forms, new institutions, and a new feeling to the whole culture, raising it to the level of Roman antiquity and in some respects surpassing it. But before we can do that, there are several layers of obstacle barring the way. We will see each in turn, but they are piled up on top of one another, each depending on the one beneath. They are a structure of exaggerations and prejudices about our collective past which amount to, I believe, a set of civilizationally harmful and misleading distortions. Let us try to clear the way before proceeding. The first and oldest and deepest prejudice is that upon the collapse of the unitary Roman state in the Occident, usually dated at 476 AD, a dam burst of inundating barbarism drowned the West, destroying civilization in all its aspects, which has been dubbed the Dark Ages, a calamity from which Europe was not to recover until the Renaissance. Here is a sample of what it is possible to say in the early 21st century.
This is what happened when the Roman Empire fell. 1,600 years ago, civilization stopped.
Well, there you have it. Regrettably, this outlandish stuff is not far removed from the popular mainstream. Here is the not-so-scholarly History Channel.
After the fall of ancient Rome, before the rebirth of the Renaissance, centuries of history have been swept under the rug. These are the Dark Ages.
And here is something on an altogether more sophisticated level, but peddling the same perception-warping message.
And what was left behind here that makes it so special? How did this learning and productivity flourish?
You have to know that the essence of Western culture, which is ancient Greek culture, was lost in Europe in the Middle Ages. It was
the Dark
lost.
Ages?
It was dark in Europe, dark in the rest of Europe.
Was it really? The Renaissance gave us the idea that the Gothic style was not in the best taste, and preferred a revived classicism. The Reformation gave us the theme that the 1,000 intervening years of Christianity had been a religious abomination. The Enlightenment demonized the Middle Ages as superstitious and barbaric, and the 19th century gave us the added twist that they were dark, very dark.
It was
the Dark
lost.
Ages?
It was dark in Europe, dark in the rest of Europe.
Well, let us take the time and the pains to lay out a different, and I believe far more realistic picture of the transmission of the classical, and in particular the Greek, cultural heritage. The first thing to note is that, concerning the Middle Ages, the source of its darkness is our own lack of understanding and our ignorance. Most of the darkness lies in ourselves, not in the millennium of human experience between 450 and 1450 AD. The main reason for our misunderstanding is the black hole at the center of our image of the past, which is the idea of Byzantium. Within our culture we have only the vaguest notions about the Roman Empire at Constantinople. We can't believe that it was really Roman, and so we are taken in by the made-up term Byzantine, which separates medieval Constantinople from the European Middle Ages. We sense it to have been a magical, marginal, static, lugubrious, and doomed place. The reason for this is simple. The continuing Roman Empire at Constantinople lasted 1,000 years after the collapse of most of its western provinces in the 400s. It was crippled and then beleaguered by Islam for centuries, and it finally succumbed in 1453. On the 29th of May that year, the Roman Empire did fall utterly to a huge Islamic army. It suffered the fate of Alexandria, Damascus, and Antioch, and so many other Roman cities. It became with time an element within Islamic civilization. Its cultural and documentary institutions were mostly disendowed and allowed to rot. And so we, in the West, as the centuries of the Ottoman superstate rolled on, forgot what Constantinople had been for so long, that is, the cultural pinnacle and political citadel of Christendom, the living centerpiece of the non-Islamic Mediterranean world. As our forgetfulness took hold, so did the freedom to pour any fantasy into that void. This is when the term Byzantine was coined, in the 1500s, by a German visitor to Constantinople, or Istanbul, long since a Turco-Islamic metropolis. Here is an image of what used to exist. This is San Vitale at Ravenna, Italy, built over 100 years after the moment when civilization is supposed to have stopped. So let us quickly sketch this world as it was before, and indeed long after, the Islamic conquests of the 600s and 700s AD. Roman and Hellenic culture had effectively fused into a single civilization and a single people between 200 BC and the birth of Christ. In 14 AD, the first emperor Augustus had a scroll written of his last will and political testament to be read out in public, one in Latin and the other in Greek. The latter was intended for the cities of the eastern provinces of the empire. Although by the mid-600s the political and legal language at Constantinople had ceased to use Latin at all, nevertheless the citizens of the continuing Roman Empire refer to themselves as Romans, as Romaioi, and use no other word right up until 1453. The loss of imperial control over the western provinces was regretted. Emperor Justinian had regained those which were considered to be the most important, that is, central and southern Italy, with Sicily, along with North Africa. Viewed from the Forum of Constantine at Constantinople, the affairs of the Romanizing and Orthodox Merovingian kings in Gaul and of the equally Orthodox and Latin-speaking Gothic kings at Toledo were matters of little real concern. The Roman Empire, through the 400s and 500s, continued to repose amid the wealth and ample extent of the populous and deeply civilized eastern provinces: Egypt, Palestine, Syria, coastal Asia Minor, and the archipelago of the Aegean and Ionian seas. There were higher-level schools at Athens, at Alexandria, with its massive and compendious library, at Antioch, and at the cities of western Asia Minor, like Ephesus, and above all at Constantinople itself. It is notorious that the Christian Emperor Justinian, by imperial order, shut down the ancient academy at Athens, dating back to Plato, in 529 AD. It is less known that in 425 AD, a century before, the Christian Emperor Theodosius had issued a decree establishing the Pandidacterion, sometimes called the Athenaeum, a kind of university, at Constantinople. It had 31 imperially endowed chairs and an unknown number of private masters, with rooms around the forum. It taught Greek and Latin, philosophy, including Aristotle and Neoplatonism, and classical medicine, as well as other subjects such as forestry. Its library is said to have held 120,000 manuscripts. Theology was taught in the great monasteries of the city. This institution of higher education trained generations of imperial administrators, legal experts, rhetoricians, and the sons of young nobles for centuries, until, in fact, The Islamic invasions of the 600s deprived the empire of the greater part of its fiscal base. The university decayed then in the 700s and early 800s, but was refounded and reorganized in 863 by the imperial regent Bardas and housed in the Magnaura Palace. It continued in existence until 1453. The greatest blow to ancient culture was the loss of the heart of the Eastern Mediterranean to the Muslims. The great library at Alexandria, legend has it that it was burned, and its schools were lost, as were those at Antioch and elsewhere. During the Islamic conquest of the Persian Empire, the Sassanid libraries and archives were burned, wiping out much of the historical record of that civilization. Manuscripts in the great libraries at Constantinople, Rome, and elsewhere were preserved, but they contained many thousands of papyrus scrolls, which with time were rotting. A program of preservation was sporadically undertaken, with the copying by hand of important texts onto much more expensive parchment. Hard choices had to be made, even at Constantinople. The primary interests of the age, of the then living Greek culture, meant that vast amounts of antique papyri that would have been of interest to us were not thought worth the effort and expense and were left to rot. Also, rare but nevertheless catastrophic fires were the cause of major losses. But the little worm chewing through the library scrolls was a silent but potent agent in the destruction of the bulk of ancient written culture. There is another whole dimension to Greek-speaking culture of the Eastern Mediterranean that is largely unknown. From almost the time of its establishment as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the late 300s AD, Christianity had been prey to fierce doctrinal disputes and to schism. All of these theological disputes arose from the impenetrable complexities concerning the nature of Christ and of the Trinity. The schismatic tendency produced the sub-churches of the Nestorians, the Monophysites, the Copts, the Monothelites. The mainstream of orthodoxy, which dominated the great church councils of the 400s and 500s, was known as Chalcedonian, based at Constantinople and at Rome, which is the common root of modern Greek orthodoxy and of Roman Catholicism, which in these centuries was a single dogmatic and ecclesiastical phenomenon. Bishop Nestorius had been Patriarch of Constantinople when his views on the nature of Christ were condemned at the First Council of Ephesus in 431 AD. This led to the breaking away of the Christian communities then living in eastern Syria and in the Sassanid Empire in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. A great Nestorian school grew up at the Romano-Greek city of Nisibis, now in eastern Turkey, near the eastern frontier of the empire, where theology, philosophy, medicine were taught at a high level. A great library there became the center for the preservation and the copying of the texts of the ancient cultural and scientific heritage. This work was to be crucial for the survival of a large part of what had come down to us today from Greek antiquity. Another great school existed at Antioch, founded by Diodorus of Tarsus. The school at Alexandria, of course, was the greatest of all, whose intellectual and religious milieu produced some of the greatest names among those revered as the Christian fathers, and those execrated as arch-heretics. We can note here that the manuscripts of Aristotle, Plato, and the Neoplatonists were studied in these semi-monastic institutions because of the intellectual advantages such philosophical expertise gave in theological polemics. You could out-reason your theological opponent by deploying the sophisticated, abstract vocabulary of ancient philosophy, and by the strength of one's rational argument. This has always been a peculiarity of Christianity since the 3rd century AD. It argued for its various scriptural interpretations using the intellectual standards, the logical methods, and the abstract distinctions of the pagan Greek philosophers. Similar to Christianity's warm embrace of the ancient world's artistic traditions, and its impulse towards imagining a densely populated spiritual world of demigods in the form of the Mother of God, of the martyrs, angels, and saints, Christianity's obsession with doctrinal dispute involved it naturally taking up the traditions of pagan philosophy. The study and cultivation of Greek science, of mathematics, geometry, medicine, optics, etc., was part and parcel of this positively viewed cultural and intellectual heritage. So, if you drop the prejudice of seeing Christianity as a fanatical destroyer of Greek thought, and understand it rather as its culmination, and if you adjust your perspective away from northwestern Europe and see that Constantinople remained the cultural and political centre of the non-Muslim world from 400 to 1200 AD, all the historical slander of there having been a so-called Dark Ages and an end to civilization is revealed to be the nonsense that it is. But additional layers have been added on top of this Dark Ages foundation. These grow more and more fantastical as time passes, and yet are given credence, and form part of our 21st century cultural wars. The first layer is the idea that the Renaissance, roughly from 1430 to 1530, was a once-and-for-all cultural revolution that broke the obscurantist power of medieval Christianity, reappropriated classical pagan culture, and created modern science and human progress.
Between the Middle Ages and the modern era, Europe underwent a massive intellectual and cultural revolution. This shift, known as the Renaissance, transformed the human experience. It prompted the exploration of science and the arts and changed the way that men and women saw themselves in relation to God. The Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed were critical stages in the development of Europe.
We will examine that century in a later episode, but here I would only recommend that one walk through one or two rooms in any Western art gallery that hangs Renaissance paintings and really look at them. it is overwhelmingly obvious that the Renaissance was not in any sense an anti-Christian or even an anti-medieval phenomenon. The culture of the Renaissance recycled the vital concerns of medieval Christianity, but in a new, more luminous, colourful and optimistic style. There was no contradiction. There was continuity. No all-shattering cultural and scientific revolution, and no breach with the medieval past. Bolted onto extravagant claims about the Renaissance is yet another, more recent and still more bizarre civilizational proposition. It is that medieval Europe was so dark, abominably dark and despicable, that something as wonderful as the Renaissance could not have developed out of it, at least not from its own cultural resources. An outside origin is now proposed for the European Renaissance. Scholarship since the 1950s has corrected the mistaken and ethnocentric beliefs of 19th century Europe about its own civilizational superiority. We now know the depth, scale, and longevity of the Chinese contributions to human progress. It is a commonplace to understand that in many areas Chinese civilization was much more technically competent than other contemporary civilizations. We are beginning to know that Hindu civilization in its own way contributed many vital insights and techniques, particularly the concept of zero and the Hindi numerical system. We also know that within the Islamic world, particularly in the 800s and 900s, there was a flourishing of intellectual and scientific culture centered at Baghdad. But these corrections to our view, most necessary and welcome as they are, have been used to drive home a polemical and aggressive message that the West literally owes its modernity, its science, its modern civilizational structures to China or to Islam.
It is they who translated and transformed the writings of the Greeks and made a gift of them to the modern Western world. The Renaissance had its beginnings in Baghdad.
For example, in 2008, a book was published proposing that a Chinese fleet sailed around the world and into a port in Tuscany and, quote, ignited the Renaissance. But the really forcefully promoted view, the current orthodoxy, is that Islam made possible, indeed caused, the European Renaissance.
The origins of the Renaissance are generally believed to lie in Italy, where a renewed interest in the classics had a huge impact on art and culture. But the foundations of the Renaissance were laid much earlier, and not in Italy, but in a town called Toledo in Islamic Spain.
In 2008, an academic at the University of Lyon in France, Sylvain Guggenheim, published a book entitled Aristotle at Mont Saint-Michel, in which he in great detail sought to dispute and adjust some of these claims and to bring a sense of perspective to the issue. He was greeted with an avalanche of condemnation and invective from the pro-multiculturalist French academic establishment, who took out a full-page ad in Le Monde condemning his book. Someone ought to translate it into English. I can only give the briefest summary here. Guggenheim points to the fact that the conquering Arabs of the 600s were possessed of an utter conviction that the word of the one God, through their prophet, was expressible only in Arabic. They disdained to learn or to use the high cultural language of the vast populations they had conquered. They did not read Greek, nor did they wish to. But they were almost immediately interested in acquiring military and any other knowledge and skills from a society that was obviously much more sophisticated than that of the Arabian Peninsula. For a brief period between the caliphate of Al-Ma'mun, 813 to 833, and that of Al-Muwatakil, 848 to 861, a window existed where Muslim intellectuals at Baghdad actively espoused a portion of Greek learning and sought to integrate it with Islamic revelation. They frequented the private library of the Caliph, called the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, that is, of Islamic learning. A great translation movement provided them with the texts they required in Arabic. These were translated by the dhimmi Christians who read Greek and held libraries of ancient pagan manuscripts. These were the Nestorians, who had been translating these texts into Syriac, their own spoken and liturgical language, for centuries. It was a short linguistic step from Syriac to Arabic. In the process, the Nestorian translators gave Arabic the Greek philosophical and scientific vocabulary and a culturally filtered version of its concepts, which Arabic lacked. We should note that there was zero interest at Baghdad or at Damascus or Cordoba in ancient Greek culture itself. There was no demand for translations of Homer, the Alexandrian poets, nor for the ethical, historical, or political thought of the ancient Greek writers. What interested them was anything that had utility, and was as much as possible devoid of cultural specificity, such as mathematics, physics, medicine, optics, etc., plus other topics classed as sciences, such as philosophy, logic, astronomy, and astrology. Theirs was a specialized and use-orientated selection. A milieu known as the Falasifa, or philosophers, espoused the philosophical methods of the Greeks and sought to promote their use. This idea was shut down by Caliph Muwatakil in the 850s, who definitively forbade any free reinterpretation of the word of Allah as recited to his prophet. From that time on, and for centuries, the Falasifa were a marginalized phenomenon, writing outside any institutional support and dissemination structure. The caliphs surrounded themselves with, as one would expect, experts in Islamic wisdom, with what has been misleadingly translated as, quote, scholars, jurists, genealogists, rationalists, theologians, and traditionalists, end quote. These were not Greek-inspired intellectuals, but the traditional pious entourage of an Islamic ruler, all of them Quranic and Sharia specialists, as one would expect. The modern image of the House of Wisdom is a fable. Christians, Jews, and Muslims did not happily hobnob there over the centuries. It was not the locus of translation of the Greek classics. Muslims did not translate the Greek science and philosophy, nor were they in the least interested in Greek culture, ethics, or in Greco-Roman law. It was not like a European university, and it could never have become an intellectual center to challenge the dominance of the mullahs. This is not to say that there was no Islamic science. There certainly was, and it made a wonderful contribution in its areas of specialism, as is evident in our words for chemistry, algebra, algorithm, and alchemy. The works of the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, which had interested Muslim scientists, doctors, and mathematicians, were disseminated across the Islamic Ummah over the succeeding centuries, and reached Islamic Spain, which saw in the 11th century a rekindling of interest among some Muslim doctors and qadis. As it happened at Baghdad, individual Jewish and Christian intellectuals took a keen interest, and because of their knowledge of Arabic, gained access to this literature. Averroes, his real name was Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, living in 12th century Al-Andalus, that is Spain, was extremely useful to Christians seeking to absorb Aristotle, a debt that Raphael and his patron, Pope Julius II, recognized when including him in the great Vatican fresco, which we call the School at Athens, that ultimate icon of Western culture. But in reality, he was no freethinker and sought to align Aristotle to his religion's scripture, just as Aquinas did in Europe. To cast him as the father of European secularism, as is done, is a massive anachronism. Nor was he an epigone of tolerance. He was a Qadi, or jurist of Sharia law. He used his expertise at the mosque at Cordoba to exhort the faithful to undertake jihad against the Christians as their religious duty. It is today quite difficult to gain an accurate picture of this milieu, on account of the eulogistic halo that is placed over the topic by contemporary Muslim scholars, and no less so by Western academics, who are ever keen to moralize at the expense of their own civilizational heritage. But it is obvious that the Islamic world did not gift Greek science to Europe in a spirit of tolerant and multicultural generosity, as is said. These philosophical and scientific manuscripts from the ancient pagan tradition, which were to be of great utility to medieval European thought, were in fact taken, not given. They were the fruit of the conquests of central Spain, especially of Toledo in 1085, a city which became the main centre of an ecclesiastically promoted translation movement from the Arabic into Latin, and of Norman Sicily, also retaken from the Muslims in 1063. Toledo and Palermo were by the 1120s Christian, indeed Latin Christian, cities, with very substantial Muslim populations remaining, Islamic power no longer holding the dominion. The picture painted by Guggenheim much more realistically accounts for what we know, that there was no equivalent to the Enlightenment within Islam, that is, no overt challenge to the absolute authority of the Quran, that there was no development of an Islamic philosophical enterprise down the centuries. It not being vital and essential to the culture, it petered out through disinterest and neglect. The Islamic culture we see all around us today is not much different from the real Islamic culture of the so-called golden age of proposed tolerance, intellectual curiosity and openness of the 800s to 1100s that is so advertised to us today. Islamic interest in some of the Greek classics and its developments in philosophical commentary, in mathematics and medicine, did involuntarily transmit valuable knowledge to Europe, just as valuable knowledge had been transmitted to Islam by Christian Greeks and by Hindus. But the translation movements into and from Arabic did not cause the Renaissance.
Extremely selective history writing.
That's right.
Let us turn now to our main theme, the cultural development in the Occident in the 1100s. The Germanic migration into the Western Empire in the 400s and 500s was disruptive and often destructive, but in its essence this was a migratory movement of peoples who came to embrace Romanness, not to destroy it. The cultural effect of the migration and the collapse of the direct rule of the empire in the West weakened the links and lessened the traffic between these regions and the Eastern Mediterranean, above all with Constantinople. The strains of the process of social and cultural assimilation had to a degree sapped the cultural resources of the remoter Roman Occident. Over the centuries, the highly cultured and educated Roman senatorial episcopal elite in Gaul and Spain became gradually less so. But they continued to speak, read, and write Latin. They operated in a literate culture based on Roman law, on documentary records, and on the writing of letters. The scholae publicae, or public schools, where rhetors were paid by the state to impart the paideia, classical literary culture, gradually disappeared in the western provinces. We lack the evidence to be able to say when, where, and how. But they certainly continued as a normal part of urban life in Italy, the cultural heartland of the Occident. Here is Cassiodorus writing in the 550s, when establishing his monastery and library at Vivarium in the toe of Italy, hoping to imitate the great Nestorian theological centre at Nisibis. Quote, "When I saw secular studies being pursued with great fervour, so much so that a great mass of men believed that such studies would bring them the wisdom of this world. I confess I was seriously perturbed that there should be no public professors of Holy Scripture, when worldly texts were the beneficiaries of a distinguished educational tradition." End quote. There were still, a century and a half into the Dark Ages, magistri seculares, secular masters, in Italy, doing a thriving business teaching young men. This tradition was unbroken 500 years later, when Benedict of Clusa wrote, quote, "My education cost my uncle 2,000 denarii, which he paid to my masters. I am indeed thoroughly learned." Elsewhere, in 1028, he boasts, quote, "I have 2 large houses filled with books. There is not a book in the whole world that I have not read." End quote. No loss of literary culture in the West, then, throughout the proposed Dark Ages. But after the 600s, a more restricted idea of the extent of Romano-Christendom's cultural stock. The lopping off of half the Mediterranean world by the Islamic invasions, the dangers of travel on the high seas, and the destruction of the 800s and 900s had narrowed the cultural repertoire in the Occident, restricting it to the literary heritage of antiquity existing in Latin. An unremarked consequence of the fall of Christian Egypt to the Muslims was the choking off of the ancient world's sole supplier of papyrus, made from the reeds of the lower Nile, Alexandria. The monasteries of northwestern Europe were forced to use expensive parchment. Indeed, we find with modern research the phenomenon of the palimpsest, a parchment skin that has been scraped of its original, often very early, script, to clean it to be reused for a new, and to us less interesting, text. We have the instruments now to expose the original underlying ink. But, as we have seen, the century of Carolingian authority, culminating around 800 with the long and fruitful reign of Charlemagne, set in place practices, institutions, and a cultural ideal that enabled the Occident to start out on the road to civilizational recovery. There followed a century and a half, 850 to 1000, of the worst invasions and destructiveness ever experienced. The loss of Sicily to the Muslims in the late 800s was a major blow to Occidental culture, breaking as it did the immediate links to a province of the Roman Empire, one that had had a Greek urban culture for more than 1.5 millennia, a space of time as long as from the emperorship of Constantine to the presidency of Barack Obama. These invasions left in their wake a Latin Christendom fragmented to a radical degree and caught in the chronic feuds and predations of its local seigneurial lords. Amidst all this disruption, certain aspects should not be lost sight of. The Roman world, and particularly Italy, had been as thoroughly Hellenized in its culture and way of life as the Mediterranean had been politically Romanized. There was, by the 500s AD, no sense in saying that the Occident, Italy and its Western European hinterlands had lost Greek culture, as is said. Hellenistic religion, culture, attitudes, ethics, and its way of life ran through the veins of the Occident. The West was Romano-Hellenic by direct inheritance from late antiquity, in a way that Islam could never be. Medieval craftsmen lost the ability to cast a great bronze equestrian statue like that of Marcus Aurelius that stood throughout the Middle Ages in front of the Lateran Palace and Basilica, believed to be a statue of Constantine. But bronze church bells were being cast at foundries in Italy and elsewhere from the 500s onwards, giving us to this day the characteristic urban sound of a society that had been Christian in culture for nearly 2 millennia. Roman building techniques were preserved, as was the Roman style. We see a fundamental uniformity of style and structure in the churches built between the 300s AD right up to the emergence of the so-called Gothic style in the mid-1100s. This was true all across Latin Christendom, from northern Spain to northern England and Germania, In the later 900s, it was in Germania, for example at Speyer, that the largest stone edifices were being built, at imperial command. As soon as the Occident had a breathing space of some security, economic infrastructures began to proliferate. With Viking invasions only recently stopped by the Norman conquest of England, the inventory of their new realm made by the Normans, the Domesday Book of 1086, tabulated the existence of 5,642 water-driven mechanical mills of various kinds. This was in the remote northwest of Europe, far from the Mediterranean core. A shift was occurring in population densities, in the productivity of agriculture, in the pattern of urban settlement and non-agricultural economic activity, gradually from the south to the north. There was also a shift in terms of overall societal productivity. This change has been much studied and multiple causes have been identified for it. But there appears to have been a positive feedback mechanism in operation. A raising of average temperatures, a certain climatic stability fostering more or less reliable harvests, a long-term rise in population, the investment by monasteries and seigneurs in the heavy-drawn ox plough, the gros charrue, field rotation of crops, the building of bridges, mills, wine presses, etc. The queue of peasants waiting to have their corn ground at the water-powered mechanical mill was a social occasion. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the 1100s inveighed against the haunting by prostitutes of such queues of rough-handed, skittish peasants, and called for the shutting down of the mills. One social factor which I find interesting, which is rarely mentioned, is the solidification of the Western form of the family around a conjugal pair. Conjugal means bound together, outside any tribal setting, and the symbiosis of such groups of families with the institution of the parish. These two aspects give us the archetype of the European form of life, the village. Such a way of life still underlies the most intimate aspects of our existence to this day. The parish church bell, la campanella or la cloche, is still to be heard in many hundreds of thousands of European villages, reminding people of their birth, their marriage and their death.
Voici quand la nuit étoilée, un nouveau-né nous est donné. Jean-François Nico, il se nomme, il est joufflu, tendre et rosé. À l'église, beau petit homme, demain tu seras baptisé. Une cloche sonne, sonne, sa voix d'écho en écho, dit au monde qui s'étonne, c'est pour Jean-François Nico, c'est pour accueillir une âme, une fleur qui s'ouvre au jour, à peine une flamme, encore faible qui réclame protection, tendresse, amour.
All these trends, which began in the 900s, reach a kind of critical mass by the early 1100s. Latin Christendom, Europe, experienced what, since 1928, has been called the 12th century Renaissance. Another Renaissance. We appear not to be able to value anything about the Middle Ages unless we dub it as some kind of Renaissance, a non-Middle Ages. It was not a dramatic rebirth, but the accumulation of processes which had been long in motion. But what a glorious efflorescence occurred as the 1100s advanced. We have in this period the greatest and most perfect of the churches in the so-called Romanesque style, which, by a miracle of stylistic metamorphosis, shifted into the soaring, elated vertical style we know as the Gothic. Underlying much of what was going on was a new and highly organized spirituality. the spirit and the rule of the monastery of Clairvaux, Clara Vallis, founded in 1115. Georges Duby tells us that the reform movement of the mid-1000s, the reknitting of the connections with the Eastern Roman Church through the traffic made possible by the Crusades, and above all by the turn in Occidental spirituality, the contemplation of the mystery of Christ's humanity, prompted a new spirit. In 1119, Pope Calixtus II deliberately replaced in the papal curia many of the men of Cluny, for centuries representing a sumptuous form of worship, and he replaced them with prelates embodying a new current. The Cistercian monastic movement, stemming from Clairvaux, was an immensely powerful spiritual pulse. Endowed with an expansive landed benefice by the Duc de Bourgogne of Burgundy, the movement adopted a highly disciplined, simple and ascetic, and yet monumentally ambitious style of life and style of art. By the end of the century, there were 18 vast and monumental Cistercian monasteries dotted throughout France, and they were spreading extremely rapidly, especially to England. Each was built according to the same plan, and the white monks, as they were known, chose a stripped-down decor that emphasized the texture of the stone, the soaring and light solidity of the edifice, and the magic of the light coming through the clear glass windows. They provided an organized avant-garde of technical and commercial practices. Their watermills, wine presses, irrigation, their estate management, their vast stone granaries, their forges and canals, and their pharmacies set the standard for all Europe, and disseminated by example to lords and their peasants the most advanced techniques of their age. There is no doubt that the order provided a powerful economic and technical impulse to the European economy of the 1100s and 1200s, helping it rise to a qualitatively higher plane, surpassing the productivity and technical sophistication of Roman antiquity. Also matched and surpassed were the educational structures of antiquity. For this was the time that saw the spontaneous birth of that so characteristic institution of our culture, the university. The cause for this was the rise of a new and burgeoning universal organization, the post-reform movement medieval church. No longer a patchwork of loosely associated regional churches, as Eastern Christianity was to remain, the Latin Church, true to its Roman roots, was a unitary, hierarchical, and universal institution. It was the only estate in life which one was not born into, and was therefore open to education and to talent. If your talent was average, then education would do. A degree was an entry ticket to the career ladder of a universal corporation, the medieval church. The chapter schools run by the cathedral clergy and some monastic schools were partially open to the sons of the lesser nobility and even to merchants' sons or any lucky boy who was sponsored by a prelate. These schools, however, tended to constrict entry to laymen as they intensified the rigour of their preparation of cadres for the priesthood. The prized areas of expertise were firstly the newly codified and rapidly copied codices of canon or ecclesiastical law, modelled on the Justinian Codex of Roman law, which had been begun by Gratian at Bologna, the so-called Decretals. The other was theology, which was becoming increasingly a subject of textual exegesis and philosophical disputation, rather than a matter of years of rote learning, as one finds in other scriptural religious cultures. Freelance masters or magistri came on the scene to offer these areas of expertise in exchange for fees. This had been the case in antiquity, and around the Imperial University at Constantinople there were many such private masters. What crystallized a new institution was the ingrained reflex within the culture for individuals to form corporations, uniting themselves in the protection and promotion of their craft. This too had come down from Roman culture. At Ostia, one can still see the dining rooms of the collegia, or clubs for members of a trade, the precursors of the medieval guilds. These collegia of independent masters, whom we would call academics, were formalized bodies subjecting themselves to an internal discipline and lobbying for written, seal-bearing charters of immunities or liberties from the city, the episcopal or papal authorities. Their humanistic curriculum, their collegiate organization, their corporate independence, and their chartered legal status and immunities were what made them unique and unprecedented, and they flourished. The most prestigious was, for law, Bologna, active since 1088 and chartered by the Western Emperor Federicus II in 1158. For theology and the liberal arts generally, that is grammar, rhetoric, dialectics, arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, the trivium and quadrivium, Paris was supreme, and remained so for centuries, becoming by the 1400s a centre of religious and legal authority rivaling Rome itself. The magistri were active in numbers already in the mid-1000s, and by 1170-1180 these had a corporate organization, and by 1200 had obtained a royal charter of independence from the chapter of Notre Dame Cathedral, which had sought to subordinate them. This meant that the masters themselves had the exclusive power to issue degrees, licentia docendi, licenses to teach. They styled themselves as Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, a corporation of masters and a location of studies, from which we derive our term university. Another highly noteworthy cultural development of the 1100s was the flourishing of the sung, profane love poetry of the Aquitaine and Limousin region of southern Gaul, the Pays d'Oc. Intimately connected with the vernacular of the region, this poetry was practiced by the Troubadour or Troubadour, as we term them in modern French. We remember that the whole region south of the Loire had remained more Roman, more Mediterranean, and less linguistically influenced than the Frankish north. The poet Dante, around 1300, had categorized the sub-Latin regional forms of speech in Europe of his day by the way they pronounced the Latin for yes, hoc. Thus the north of Francia spoke the langue d'oil, or of oui, for yes, the south the langue d'oc, using the Latin hoc for yes, and he proposed calling the multiple dialects of Italy the lingua di si, the language of si, for yes. Thus we get our modern term for the Languedoc. The troubadour poetry arose in the courts of the counts of southern Francia, and was spread by the great patrons, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, to the north, to England, to Germany, Lombardy, Catalonia, and to Portugal. It soon became a cultural craze.
C'est là que ça débute en tout cas, parce que c'est un moment dans l'histoire de notre culture où soudainement les préoccupations du cœur humain se lancent dans une poésie d'une telle force, d'une telle droiture, d'une telle beauté qu'il est impossible de passer outre.
The origin of this development too is the subject of ferocious dispute and of no consensus among scholars. There have been nearly a dozen theories, one school claims a Latin and devotional origin within Europe, and the other strongly claims a debt by direct imitation to the poetry of Islamic Spain. The latter is argued on the grounds of parallels of form and attitudes, and is based on the claim that profane and erotic poetry was unknown and alien to medieval Europe up to that time. It must have come from outside. We have seen this argumentation already applied to intellectual matters. The earliest troubadour known to us was the high aristocrat Guillaume IX of Poitiers, who had a stormy life and loves. He was a leader of the crusade of 1101 to the Holy Land, but his retinue was cut to pieces by the Turks while crossing Asia Minor, and he and only 6 survivors reached Antioch. It is very likely that he was the heir to an already flourishing tradition, so consummate is his style. The courtly milieu in the castles of Aquitaine lies at the origin of the culture, with many young bachelor men, bachelor originally meant a young knight, attending a court presided over by a powerful woman, the seigneur's wife, called the domina. She was surrounded by her noble maids-in-waiting. I would just remark that as a highly feminized social setting, this could not have been further removed from the court culture of the emirs of Islamic Spain. The charged sexual chemistry, hemmed around with the severe prohibitions of religion and of the aristocratic social code, produced a sublimation of yearning in word and song. The domina was courted, we have our word courtship from this setting, from a distance by the usually younger knight poet or troubadour. He suffered patiently, knowing that consummation was unattainable, but instead devoted his life and his person, in an attitude which borrowed heavily from religious devotion, to her as an ideal of love. A later development saw the explicit evocation of the Virgin Mary in the role of the domina. Anna Azima is of the view that all was not completely chaste, however.
Expulser totalement la sexualité.
J'en doute fort. Ça, c'est entre vous et moi. Ne le répétez pas. Mais j'en doute fort. Je pense qu'il y a eu plusieurs grilles de lecture pour tout ce répertoire. Il y a certains poèmes qui sont très clairs. Il y a aussi, on le savait, des règles de conduite entre les amoureux qui disaient que l'on donnait la main, que l'on donnait le regard, que l'on donnait le pied, que l'on donnait le bras, que l'on donnait le sein, puis peut-être aussi plus de choses. Certains poèmes sont très clairs.
Born with, and perhaps out of, the Crusades, the poetry of the Troubadours flourished and spread throughout all Christendom, setting the tone and style for court culture from the Rhineland and Hungary to southern England, to Catalonia and to Lombardy. Like the church, the baronial political culture, and like the architecture of the time, the troubadour culture was uniform and dominant across all of Europe, and accordingly influences our ideas about relations between the sexes to this day. We have time only briefly to sketch one other great civilizational accession of that age, the so-called Gothic style. This sprang up, almost defying any explanation, within the ecclesiastical milieu of the court of Philippe Auguste and of the dukes and counts of Francia, north of the Loire. The external buttress allowed the raising of immensely high walls which themselves lacked the weight-bearing mass of the traditional Roman building methods. In the walls were placed broad expanses of coloured, lead-joined glass, made possible because the wall was no longer primarily a weight-bearing element. The Roman dome was neither possible nor appropriate. Instead, the Carolingian and Romanesque bell tower was elongated upwards to give us the spire. These buildings, which were to sprout in every major centre across Latin Christendom for the following 300 to 400 years, were exultant celebrations of a material paradox, the lightness of weight, stone rising of its own nature towards the heavens. It was known at the time as the opus frangenicum, work in the French manner. The term Gothic was an insult, the Goths were barbaric, coined in Italy in the 1500s to promote a return to the classical column and dome style, which we call the Renaissance architectural style. Outrageously, the early 19th century dishonestly appropriated this universal style of Latin Christendom and broke it down into various national variants to serve the new ideology of nationalism. Let us end with one of the 12th century's most striking achievements, the Gothic smile. The insight into the angelic humanity of heaven, so characteristic of the European spirit. This was not the Dark Ages, nor was it medieval obscurantism. It was the flowering of a deeply rooted, high and unique civilization with a genius all of its own.